What if I told you that once in the name of holiness, men dug up corpses to put them on trial? That faithful believers whipped themselves until their backs split open? That some women starved themselves to death, convinced their suffering would bring them closer to God? This is not fiction. This is not a horror movie. This is history. During the Dark Ages, the line between divine faith and deep, paralyzing fear was often invisible. Europe was a land where plague could strike without warning, where demons were blamed for illness, and where salvation was thought to be won through the pain of the body. To live in those centuries wasn't just to live in the shadow of castles or beneath the gaze of clergy. It was to exist in a world ruled by invisible forces, both heavenly and hellish. Every misfortune was a message from God, every unusual event a test of faith, and in that terrifying uncertainty, rituals were born, not gentle, not peaceful, but brutal. These were acts not of celebration, but of desperation, desperation to survive, to be forgiven, to be spared from the wrath of an angry, all-seeing God. Tonight, we peel back the pages of forgotten chronicles to reveal 5 of the most disturbing religious rituals ever recorded. Rituals so strange, so haunting, you'll wonder how much of it was faith and how much was fear. Let's begin. It sounds like a scene from a nightmare, a cold cathedral, torches flickering, priests gathered in silence. And in the center of it all, a rotting corpse dressed in sacred robes propped up on a throne. But this isn't fiction. This was the Synod of the Cadaver, Rome, January of 897. Pope Formosus had been dead for 9 months. His body was decomposing, his fingers curled, his face sunken and gray. And yet Pope Stephen VI, his successor, had him exhumed, dragged into the Lateran Basilica and placed on trial. Yes, a literal trial against a dead man. A deacon was assigned to speak on Formosus's behalf. The charges: violating church law, seizing power unlawfully, and daring to sit on the papal throne while supposedly being unworthy. Stephen's voice echoed through the halls as he ranted at the corpse, calling him a heretic, a liar, an impostor. The corpse didn't respond, but that didn't matter. After the bizarre proceedings, the verdict was predictable: guilty. As punishment, the dead pope's papal robes were torn off, the 3 fingers he had used for blessings were cut off, and his body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River like trash. This was not just vengeance. This was theater. Stephen VI wanted to erase Formosus from memory, to humiliate him beyond death. But in doing so, he revealed the darkest truth of all, that power in the church was often more about politics than piety. That even in death, one could be used as a symbol, as a warning, but the story doesn't end there. Soon after, Rome was rocked by disgust and fear. The people rebelled. Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned, then strangled to death in his cell. The corpse of Formosus was later retrieved from the river and reburied, this time with honor. Yet the memory of that grotesque trial never faded. It became one of the most macabre spectacles in church history. A reminder that even the holiest institutions were not immune to madness or cruelty. When justice becomes a performance, and the dead are paraded like actors, what's left of faith? In the grim shadow of the Black Death, when half of Europe's population perished within just a few short years, people began to believe that the plague wasn't just a disease, it was divine punishment. And when you believe that God is angry, you don't seek a cure, you seek forgiveness. That's where the flagellants came in. They were not priests, not scholars, not rulers. They were ordinary people, merchants, farmers, even children who abandoned their homes, stripped to the waist, and walked barefoot from town to town in long, solemn processions. As they marched, they sang hymns and chanted prayers. But the most haunting part was this: they carried whips, leather scourges tipped with metal spikes or bone shards, and in perfect rhythm they began to beat themselves, over and over. Blood sprayed onto the cobblestones, flesh tore. Some collapsed from exhaustion or infection. Others were carried away in silence. To them, pain was purification. The blood was an offering. By suffering in public, they believed they could mirror the passion of Christ and perhaps, just perhaps, convince God to stop the plague. Crowds gathered, some cheered, some wept. Many believed the flagellants were holy men, saints walking among them. But others, especially within the church, began to see danger. The flagellant movement quickly spiraled beyond control. They rejected the authority of the Pope. They claimed to receive visions from heaven. In some cities, they demanded executions of Jews or those they blamed for the plague. Their processions began to resemble mobs. Desperation turned to frenzy. Faith became fanaticism. By the 1350s, Pope Clement VI had enough. He declared the flagellants heretical, and they were hunted down, imprisoned, or excommunicated. The whips were burned, the processions vanished. But the scars remained, not just on their backs, but on the psyche of Europe. The flagellants had shown how terror and religion, when tangled together, could twist ordinary people into living sacrifices. Pain, they believed, was the price of grace. but in the end their blood could not stop the plague, and their screams became just another echo in a continent drowning in death. It began without warning. In the sweltering heat of a midsummer day in 1518, a woman stepped into the narrow street of Strasbourg in the Holy Roman Empire and began to dance. Not with joy, not for celebration. She danced in silence, without music. Without rest. Her name was Frau Trophia, and no one knew why she couldn't stop. At first people laughed, then they stared. Hours passed, her feet bled, her body trembled, but she did not stop. Days later, dozens joined her, then hundreds. Men, women, even children, writhing, twisting, spinning until their shoes wore out and their muscles collapsed. This wasn't a festival, it was a frenzy. Historical accounts tell of people dancing uncontrollably in streets, in churches, in open squares. Many collapsed from sheer exhaustion, others suffered heart attacks, some reportedly danced until the moment they died, and this wasn't the only time. Similar outbreaks had occurred as early as the 7th century, with major episodes in the 1300s and 1400s across Germany, the Netherlands, and France. It became known as the Dancing Plague, and no one, not even the church, understood what was happening. Clergy declared it a divine punishment, a curse for sin. Some believed the dancers were possessed by demons. Others claimed it was the wrath of St. Vitus, a martyred saint whose spirit could torment the sinful with uncontrollable movement. So what did they do? They built stages. They hired musicians to play for the dancers. They turned churches into dance floors, hoping the dancers would finish the curse if allowed to move freely. But it only made things worse. Some historians now believe the cause may have been mass psychogenic illness, what we would today call mass hysteria, fueled by religious fear, famine, and stress from disease. Others point to toxic rye ergot, a fungus that produces hallucinations similar to LSD. But back then, people didn't know what a hallucination was. They only knew demons, saints, sins. They saw the madness and blamed the heavens. The dancing plague remains one of the strangest documented events in medieval history, a moment when faith, fear, and the fragile human mind collided in a deadly performance. And when the music finally stopped, the silence was filled with the whispers of the dead. Imagine waking up one morning with a burning sensation in your fingertips, not a fever, not a sunburn, a fire. A creeping, gnawing, consuming fire that begins in your limbs and spreads through your body like a curse. Within hours, your skin turns black, your fingers rot, your feet blister, and you scream, not from what you see, but from what you feel. As if your flesh is being cooked from the inside. This wasn't a legend. It was a recurring nightmare in medieval Europe. They called it the Holy Fire of St. Anthony. Also known as ergotism, this horrifying illness struck hundreds, sometimes thousands at a time, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and in many cases, the slow decay of human flesh while the victims were still alive. But to those living in the Dark Ages, the explanation wasn't scientific. It was divine punishment. The afflicted believed they were sinners, touched by the hand of God in anger, and so they turned to St. Anthony, the patron saint of skin diseases, for mercy. Pilgrimages were made to monasteries bearing his name. Processions of the dying, crawling on their knees, begging for relief. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony welcomed them, dressed in dark robes marked with the Greek Tau cross, offering both prayer and rudimentary care. Some were bathed in wine, anointed with holy oil. Some had limbs amputated without anesthesia. Some were burned in purification rituals, and yet the agony continued. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the fire in their blood came not from the heavens, but from their bread, the culprit. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye during wet seasons. It slipped into the grain supplies undetected, especially among the poor. When consumed, it produced a powerful alkaloid, similar to LSD, which constricted blood vessels, caused psychotic delusions, and led to gangrene. Entire villages would be struck down. Children hallucinated serpents in the sky. Mothers screamed as their limbs blackened and fell off. The priests chanted. The monks wept, but no one suspected the bread. It wasn't until centuries later that doctors and chemists began to connect the dots. But by then, the legend of St. Anthony's fire had become sacred, a reminder that in the Dark Ages, even suffering could be sanctified. Even poison could be holy, and perhaps the cruelest part, the people believed their torment brought them closer to God, because in a world ruled by fear and faith, pain wasn't just punishment, it was purification. In the year 1349, the streets of Strasbourg echoed with a sound stranger than any chant, more haunting than the tolling of funeral bells. It was the sound of whips cutting flesh, and of men groaning not in pain, but in ecstasy. They were called flagellants, men in long, tattered robes, barefoot, eyes sunken from fasting. They moved from town to town in lines, often 50, sometimes 100 at a time. Each man carried a whip, usually tipped with metal spikes or embedded with fragments of bone, and each night at dusk they would gather in public squares and begin their ritual. A circle would form. They would sing dirges, guttural hymns in Latin, and then one by one they would strip to the waist. Then the whipping began, slow at first, then frenzied, backs split open. Blood flew, and no one cried for help, because this was not punishment. This was salvation. The flagellants believed that the Black Death sweeping across Europe was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and if the church wouldn't act fast enough, then they would. They would beat the sin out of the world. These were not lunatics on the margins. They were teachers, craftsmen, even minor nobles, and their rituals were not random. They followed strict rules. 33.5 lashes each session, in honor of the years Christ walked the earth. Every stop in a new town was precisely timed. No one spoke to women, no one laughed, no money was accepted, just blood, prayer, and the road. At first, the church tolerated them. Some even welcomed the movement as a kind of holy fervor that might inspire repentance. But soon, things changed. They started turning violent. Some towns began to see them not as pilgrims, but as judges. They accused priests of corruption. They burst into churches and threw down icons. They blamed Jews, heretics, and even clergy for the plague. In some places, they sparked riots. The Pope, at the time, Clement VI, grew nervous. He saw a movement growing beyond his control. By 1350, he condemned them as heretics. Flagellant leaders were arrested, some were executed, and gradually the blood-red tide receded from the streets of Europe. But the memory remained, a memory of men who believed pain could cleanse sin, who thought that blood might open the gates of heaven, who believed that by becoming walking wounds they could force God to look down, and perhaps show mercy. Because in the Dark Ages, when fear ruled over science and desperation swallowed reason, pain wasn't a sign of madness, it was a test of faith, and every lash was a prayer carved into flesh. It's the winter of 897 AD in Rome. Candlelight flickers across the marble walls of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Cardinals sit grim-faced. The audience is silent, watching something that feels less like a church trial and more like a scene from a fever dream. At the center of the room, dressed in full papal robes, sits a corpse, literally. Pope Formosus had been dead for 9 months. His flesh was decomposed, his fingers rotting. Yet here he sat, propped up on a throne, as the living Pope, Stephen VI, demanded that he be judged for crimes against the Church. This grotesque event would go down in history as the Cadaver Synod, one of the most disturbing episodes in medieval religious history. But why? The answer lies in the toxic politics of the papacy. The 9th century was a time when being pope wasn't just about faith, it was about power, land, armies, and allegiance. And Formosus had made enemies, many. He had crowned multiple kings, aligned with the wrong factions, crossed the wrong nobles, and when he died, Pope Stephen VI, loyal to Formosus' rivals, saw a chance to make an example out of the dead man. So Stephen dug him up and put him on trial. He appointed a deacon to speak for the corpse. Charges were read: usurping the papacy, breaking canon law, ruling while excommunicated. As Formosus sat silently, because of course he was dead, the living pope screamed accusations into the silent, stinking air. Then came the verdict: guilty. His papal robes were ripped off. 3 fingers, the ones used for blessings, were cut from his right hand. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River like garbage. All of it done in God's name. The crowd was stunned, some cheered, others wept. And for months afterward, Rome was haunted by rumors that Formosus' body had washed ashore and performed miracles. His corpse, they whispered, refused to stay buried. Eventually, the backlash came. Pope Stephen VI was overthrown, imprisoned, and strangled to death in his cell. Future popes reversed the Cadaver Synod's verdict and reburied Formosus with honor, but the stain remained. This wasn't just political vengeance, it was theological theater, a warning carved into the pages of history. In the Dark Ages, even death couldn't save you from your enemies. The Cadaver Synod was not about justice. It was about power and how far people were willing to go to erase the past, even if it meant dressing up a corpse and putting him on trial.